Okej, men vi sätter igång det här samtalet. Vi är redan lite sena, så vi börjar. So nice to have you here. Very, very welcome. We actually have this book that we talked about. You wrote a book about the climate. And this, I find it very useful. And so my first question to you is, why did you write this book? And why did you pick this format of the book that you will eventually see how the format is? You can explain maybe a bit about it.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you all for being here on this beautiful evening, and thank you for inviting me. We met online at a culture workshop for artists, and I'm really glad that it's turned into this collaboration and given me the chance to be at this magical place that you all are so lucky to live in. Yes, why did I write this book? Because we need more climate action. We need more people who are part of the team climate that are working to stop climate change and to make the changes we need. And it feels to me as a researcher like the most important thing that I can do is take the information that I have and that scientists have that is maybe in peer-reviewed papers, it might be behind paywalls, it might be very technical, and try to make it accessible to people who need it and can use it. So I'm doing more and more of that. The book is one way. I also write for magazines and try to reach out and have meetings like this in other ways. But I am a reader. I've always loved reading books. I always had a goal to write a book, but I know now that about 80% of people have a goal to write a book, but about a third of people did not read any books in the last year. So there's a mismatch there. But I actually am a reader and love reading, and I can say that books have changed my life. I mean, they're the way that an important way for me that I understand the world and that I learn new things. So I guess I wanted to have a one-stop shop where you could have what you need to both be informed, be hopefully inspired, be reassured, go through the facts, feelings, and actions that we need, and link those three elements with personal stories. And so I try, readers have told me they feel like reading the book is a conversation with a friend, and I'm really happy if they have that experience, because that's what I was going for, to make it not so scary and overwhelming to get to climate, to talk about and think about and act on climate.
And did anything surprise you while writing this book?
One thing that surprised me scientifically was that when I was in grad school, I learned that there is warming that's baked into the climate. So at that time, we thought that when people completely stop emitting carbon, there would still be some more warming locked into the system. And the latest science says that that's actually not the case, which is very good news for us. So that means that as fast as we can, I mean, what we need to do now to stabilize the climate is stop burning fossil fuels and stop adding the pollutant carbon to the atmosphere. Once we do that, the climate will actually stop warming. So that's more hopeful than I thought.
That's good, because actually you get a bit frightened, of course, by this book, but also get hope. Do you think, yes, is it important for scientists to write a book like this? Or is it, I mean, what's your task as a scientist? Or could you evolve on that?
I mean, I can speak how I see my own task personally. I guess coming from Lund University, Lund has a mission to understand, explain, and improve the world and the human condition. And I actually really believe in that mission. I think universities are the only institution in society that has that mission. Could we live up to it better? Absolutely. But I think that actually being what we're aiming for is something I do really believe in. Within that, as a researcher and scientist, I have the role of research, so discovering new things, teaching, sharing what I know and learning from my students, and outreach and impact, basically. So taking those first two things and bringing them to outside of the university to artists or neighbors or businesses or others, people in society. I think the universities need to do much better at actually supporting and encouraging and making it really a part of our job to do that impact, because it's pretty unsustainable as a side project, which is how it kind of is now. But it really is and should be, I think, part of what we do as scientists. And that doesn't mean that every scientist needs to do it. We can have scientists who focus mostly on one of those different areas, or focus on research that's kind of blue sky discovery that's not right away focused on application. It just focuses on expanding human knowledge. That's important too. But in the case of climate, we know it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it. That's the summary of the science. And to me, the most important thing now is for me to contribute is not really doing new science to, refine by 0.0001% the certainty within one of those categories, but rather to convey what we do know, because we have enough knowledge to act on, and we actually have a very short time to act.
Yeah, and the book is quite full of different knowledge that you did research yourself and take from others. But you also have quite a tip for us how to live with the climate crisis. And one is the 5 stages of radical climate acceptance that you describe. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, these are stages partly inspired by others' work, but largely drawn from my own experience, which is that it's quite a lot to take in the climate crisis, and for many people may have been thinking about it or aware of it for a very long time, but a lot of people are waking up now every day to the severity of the climate crisis, and it's a lot to handle. So I see this process happening in 5 stages, which are ignorance, avoidance, doom, all the feels, and purpose. And it's not just a stairway that you go up. There's certainly interactions, but basically it is kind of a progression from ignorance, where you need to learn about the climate crisis from somewhere. We don't have this knowledge baked into our DNA somehow. It's not an instinct. We need to learn from books or teachers or parents or people around us. Avoidance is often a place to spend a very long time where, this might challenge, some of my current practices, or some things I take for granted, or some things I enjoy or I think aren't possible to change, and I don't want to face those difficult ideas. But at some point, it becomes more uncomfortable to continue to avoid these difficult truths rather than face them. And that's where the 3rd stage often comes in, of doom. So I see a lot of people who, start Googling and fall down quite a dark rabbit hole of the internet, and, a lot of worst case scenarios. And the climate crisis is severe, and there are already harms and losses that are happening, and it can get really bad. So I don't want to undersell that. But at the same time, doom is not the end of the road. It's kind of the bottom that maybe people hit before, and the way to get through it is this 4th stage of all the feels. And that's what the middle part of the book is about, which is dealing with grief, mourning losses that actually have already occurred or will occur in our lifetimes, that we actually will experience, losses from climate change. Being angry about the injustices of climate change, that the youngest generation and the poorest people have done the least to cause climate change and are suffering the most. But also finding joy and purpose and meaning in building community and figuring out how we, in each of us, can actually be part of contributing to the solution. And I think that purpose, aligning our values with our actions and using our skills and talents to actually make the world a better place, is really meaningful, and it is extremely motivating, and there can be a lot of joy along the way. So those are the stages that I see. And the goal of acceptance is not giving up. It's not accepting the worst outcomes. It's kind of a constant dance between trying to be open-eyed and see the world as it is, without making judgments, and keeping up the energy to say, okay, I'm going to change what I can and come to terms and accept what I can't. And that's an ongoing process. And I mean, especially because what we can't change, I mean, that's an open question. It depends on human nature and what are humans actually capable of, and how well can we work together, and how creative can we be. So those aren't scientific questions questions that can be answered with data. That's questions about what humans actually make possible.
And you describe yourself as a scientist a bit like Cassandra, who knows the truth and tells the truth, but it's not always easy to be that person. But you did a lot of personal changes in your life. So how was that? And you wrote about them in the book. How was your experience of doing those changes?
I mean, it's been great. It's definitely an ongoing journey. So it's not like, oh, I've done everything and now I'm at the end. But I have made some pretty substantial changes. So in 2010, when I moved to Sweden, I was a frequent flyer. That year, I actually took 15 round-trip flights. And at that time, that definitely puts me in this 1% of the world's population who take half the flights and cause half of climate pollution. And when you consider that flying causes about as much climate pollution as Germany, that's really substantial, that a tiny percentage of people cause so much harm. So that was avoidance for me. I really didn't want to think about that, even though I knew, intellectually those data. So moving here to Sweden, I mean, I came because I got this job at Lund University. I really didn't think about the carbon consequences of it, that I would be so far away from my family and friends who I still want to see in person. And then I just avoided thinking about it. But I finally got to this moment where I went to a climate conference in Vienna, and I flew there from Copenhagen near Lund, where I live, and my friend Charlie had taken the train from a similar distance away in the UK. And we spent 12 hours in this stuffy, windowless room looking at PowerPoints of, already in 2012, here's how bad the climate crisis is, here's how much worse it's going to get, here's the things we need to do, basically stop burning fossil fuels. What is the fastest way to burn fossil fuels is get on a plane. And I just felt like I was a doctor in a room full of doctors who were puffing on cigarettes and telling our patients to quit. I just couldn't live with the cognitive dissonance anymore. So since I knew that Charlie had started taking the train instead of flying, we had a conversation about it. And he really encouraged me and said, basically by his example and by his stories, I realized, okay, I can still have collaborations internationally. I can still travel. I can still go places. I don't have to completely, I think I was afraid that I wasn't willing to completely stop flying. And so I wasn't willing to think about it at all because I wasn't going to be able to give up that flight home to see my family. But I wasn't thinking about all the flights that I could live without, or that I could substitute, or the trips I didn't actually even need to take in the first place. So what I came to out of that conversation was I followed Charlie's example, which was he had stopped flying within Europe. And I said, okay, that's something I can do. And it actually was so relieving because before then I had made spreadsheets and had analysis paralysis. And, when I was thinking about a trip, I would look at the time, money, and carbon costs and try to weigh them out in some way, which doesn't really work because those three qualities are not really interchangeable. So anyway, long story short, it's made my life a lot better. And it actually led to some romance because when I met my husband, on our fourth date, we took a train trip to Paris. And I thought, this is going to end our, month-old relationship or whatever. Spending 15 hours together and all these train transfers and so on is going to be stressful. But we actually liked each other better when we got into Paris. And I think that's a very good sign. And I would recommend it as a relationship test, actually, to do early on. It can save you a lot of time. So we then, when we got married, we basically had an almost month-long wedding by train. We both come from North America. So we did fly to Edmonton in Canada, where his family is. And we had a ceremony with just our parents and siblings there. And then we went around North America and had, I think it was 16 parties hosted by friends. And it was in beautiful places. People made lovely food for us. The smallest was just with 2 other people. The biggest was about 30 people. But most of them were, you know, we could fit around one dinner table. And we had amazing quality time with the people that we loved in the places where they were and traveled to them by train. So I think it's actually brought more adventure and more fun into my life, and more in line with my actions, with my values. Just feels better. So that was the biggest change I made, and that made the biggest difference, because if you fly, that's your biggest source of climate pollution.
Yeah, in the book you have like facts that this and this and this you could do. Would you like to describe that in short?
Give me the bullet points. Yeah. Okay. So if we're talking about your personal carbon footprint, first of all, you need to, if you are low income, you don't need to worry about your personal carbon footprint. But if you are at or above the average emissions for your country, it is something you need to look at. And basically, if you ever fly on a plane, you're in the group that needs to look at your carbon footprint. Or if you drive a lot, you're above average. We can say that. In Sweden, it's if you earn more than about 27,000 kronor per month, you're in this top 10%. And the things you can do to most quickly reduce your personal emissions are to go car, flight, and meat free. So that will reduce it the most. If, like me, you freak out about the idea of committing to never getting on a plane again, for example, cutting as much as you can and finding creative ways to do that is the best. And sustainable travel budget in Sweden is about 20 kilometers a day of driving per person per year. So that's something to aim for. A healthy and sustainable diet that would be sufficient for everyone and protect biodiversity would be reducing meat consumption or animal product consumption to about 2 servings of chicken, fish, and eggs per week, 2 burgers per month, and 1 glass of milk or piece of cheese the size of your thumb per day.
You get that? Okay, so how did it all start? You told us something about your family living across the sea, but what do they do? How did you begin to work with climate?
Let's see. When I grew up in the countryside, in the hills on a dirt road, and spent a lot of my childhood running around in nature and really enjoying hiking, first just near my house, and then around 15 teenager years, I spent a lot of time in the Sierra Nevada mountains, which are extremely beautiful, backpacking and climbing. So I love being out in nature, out in the mountains. And when I started university, I got a job as a research assistant where I got paid to do that, and I thought it was amazing. And then I really liked research, so that was also a benefit, because I thought research was going to be this really boring, technical, stuffy thing. And my first day of this job, we were standing around in a parking lot, and we had a bunch of Ziploc bags and some Sharpie pens and some rope, and that was about it. I was like, oh, this is how you do science? Okay, I can do this. It was a lot less intimidating and more creative and more teamwork than I thought.
And then I was thinking about the wine. Do you want to tell us something about the wine?
Yeah, so I grew up in a town called Sonoma. It's about an hour north of San Francisco, and it's a wine growing region. You might have heard of Napa. That's just next door. That's where I went to high school. Sonoma calls itself real wine country, so there's some friendly rivalry between the two. But wine is like the lifeblood of our area. It's the main employer. It generates tourism, which also runs the economy there, and it's really important to where I come from. So when I started my PhD, I got the chance to work on a paper about the climate impacts of California under a high emission scenario where we don't do what we need to, and a low emissions where we actually make this transition to a fossil free world. So I chose to look at wine. And that became the basis of my PhD. Wine is a climate-sensitive crop. It really connects people in place. It's something that people care about. I like to say wine is climate change you can taste, because we see changes in wine happening now that we can attribute to climate change, that are changing what grapes grow well somewhere, what style of wine people can make. And it's a really tangible example of climate change on your dinner table that maybe makes it feel more real and everyday than some of the other things I had studied before.
And also sorrow for you that some tastes will disappear, or have already actually disappeared.
Yeah.
You argue the one key to stabilizing the climate will be in change mindset, and I find that very interesting. That's a shift away from what you call the exploitation mindset and towards something else. What is that?
Yeah, this is something that I was trying to, I really wanted the book to be applicable, but at the same time, especially if I'm telling my own stories, it only is my own experience that I can tell a story about, and everyone has a different circumstance and situation. So I also wanted to kind of zoom out and give some bigger picture principles that hopefully would apply across situations, so that people can think for themselves, okay, what should I do in this situation, or what kind of guidance do I have? So basically my diagnosis is that a fundamental root cause of many of our problems is this exploitation mindset, and that's based on the two faulty ideas. One, that some people are superior to other people instead of recognizing people's equal value, and two, that people are superior to and should dominate nature. And I think those are actually rather new ideas. They've just become something that it's easy to take for granted in the industrialized world, but they're not true, and they're not a given, and they haven't been around forever, and I hope they won't be around that much longer, because I would much rather live in a world where we have the regeneration mindset as our default, and that is working with rather than against nature, harnessing the power of nature to renew itself, and for humans to improve ourselves and with nature. So the three principles of regeneration are to center the well-being and care for people and nature, both together. Second, to stop harm at its source rather than treating its symptoms. So in the case of climate, stop burning fossil fuels, stop destroying nature. And third, to increase our resilience, and that's our ability to cope with and thrive through change, to be flexible. And that's based on diversity, and it's based on connection. So what makes a system or a person resilient is having connection and being able to recover and support each other through tough times. We also need to restore nature. I was talking with Gunilla on the way down here about restoring some of the wetlands in Gotland, which play a really important role in slowing down the water runoff so that there's time to absorb the rain that falls and replenish the groundwater. So restoration and resilience can also be a part of how we treat nature to cope with the changes that we can't avoid.
Yeah. You focus in your book very much on what you as an individual can do. Why do you do that? Because I guess all society has to change, not just each person.
Yeah, I guess it's because, corporations or nation states don't read books. So I can only address people. And ultimately, I think, of course, politicians have a lot of responsibility. Businesses have a lot of responsibility and culpability in many cases. For having, in the fossil fuel industry's case, for having organized a disinformation campaign and still really blocking climate action very actively. So I don't ignore those things at all, and a lot of the book is actually about that, because I think a lot of people don't know that full story. But nonetheless, this is a book targeted at the people I went to college with, the people who read books, the people who are in this top 10% of climate polluters globally. That's that if you make more than 27,000 crowns per month, which is most Swedes. So I'm trying to empower people to realize, wait a minute, I am lucky and privileged enough to live in a democracy. Only about 18% of people actually have that option to or live in that circumstance right now. So we're already extremely lucky with that. If I have an education, if I have a job that gives me some security and status, if I have a neighborhood and a nice place to live, which clearly everyone here certainly does, those are the things that give you power. And we can use that power not just as consumers, which we've been talking about, lifestyles like reducing flying and driving and meat eating, but also as citizens and as how we engage as part of organizations, how we invest our money personally and how we invest our time with the work that we do, and how we influence others, what kind of role model we are. So these 5 roles are something that I talk about in the book, and they're basically the bridge between personal and collective action. But I think there's sometimes collective action is this mythical beast that we never really touch. It's like, oh yeah, but we need everything to change. We need all of society to change. Yeah, but we do. But that change isn't a waterfall. It's not going to come down from the top. It's a circle where people, both individuals and groups, civil society, government, and business are actually all connected. And the changes that we make, and it's also people who sit in government, and those people here in Sweden are elected by us, which is going to be up for voting, of course, in a few weeks, which is super important. Businesses are regulated by government and also supported by consumers in our consumer and citizen role. So these connections are actually how change happens, and basically change on any of these levels through any of these roles opens up new possibilities. So I want to encourage people to start where they are and to make climate action part of their everyday lives, and basically to turn the things that you're already doing into climate action, rather than seeing climate action as something that's totally new and different and outside of what you might already be doing, and therefore difficult and too far away and hard to start.
Yes, and to dare to be the first one to start, not wait for everyone else. What is the difference you see when you come from California to Sweden? What can the rest of the world learn from Sweden? Or
Something very special and precious about Sweden is the level of trust in society here, that people do really trust each other and trust the government by and large, and trust sort of people in society to do their part and for the whole system to kind of work. And I think it's really important to not take that for granted, because that's something that has to be continually reinvented and invested in and upheld and supported. But that is something really special, I think, about Swedish society that gives us a lot of opportunities to make change happen actually faster, because we know from social science research that change, trust is a really important part of acceptance, and having these kind of democratic structures where people can make their voices heard, where everyone is listened to and decisions are fair, is essential for making changes legitimate and actually happen in practice, as opposed to stuck in courtrooms being litigated for 20 years or, not actually being implemented, even if on paper something sounds good. So that, I think, is something really important.
What are your advice to people on Gotland? You notice that we are very dependent in cars, for example. And I think the car fleet on Gotland might be the oldest one in Sweden as well. Do you have any thoughts about that? And also, with the dependence on tourism, for example.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I mean, Sonoma is also a very tourist-dependent economy. It's a curse and a blessing in my experience. Maybe some of you have that experience as well, because it's wonderful to host people who appreciate the specialness of where you come from and to share that with people who can enjoy it. But it also puts a lot of demands on society. I mean, Gunilla and I were talking on the way here about, cruise ships and where are the toilets for all those people when they're in Visby for 3 hours, for example, and, the waste and the Baltic issue. So it does put a lot of stress. I guess, in general, long-distance tourism is just not sustainable unless you're biking or sailing, basically, like any other means, or hiking, I guess. Any other means of travel is really high emissions. So cruise ships, planes, cars. So I guess from a tourism perspective, it would be ideal for Gotland to try to attract people who will come from not that far away and stay longer. And that probably means getting outside of Visby so that the benefits of tourism are more evenly distributed around the island. And that would probably look pretty different than how it looks today. I mean, I've had the chance to visit Gotland 3 times before. This is my 4th time. I mean, maybe I've spent 10 days in total, or I don't know, a bit more than that. But I'm not an expert on Gotland, so I don't want to be telling you what to do. But since you asked, I mean, I can imagine like having more farm stays, more kind of trails that connect towns, both biking and walking, drawing people out around the island and having them stay longer and having fewer of them is probably more sustainable. In terms of cars, I mean, you and I have talked about there is no bus that comes here. Like, I had to get a ride in a car to make it here from Visby. And so, I mean, my research, we just published a paper on 12 ways to reduce cars in cities. So that we know, or I know what works there. I haven't studied reducing car dependence in rural areas, but there is work on that, and that's also important. It's basically like, okay, how could you live on Gotland and be within these 20 kilometers of driving per day? Is it because you maybe live in a city that's not in the summer and don't have a car there? Or so you use up your annual driving budget when you're on Gotland? That could be one way. Do you share resources so that neighbors take turns going into the city or do the driving that's needed? So like, okay, we're going to do a shop for everybody on our street and only need 1 car for that, and we take turns doing that. I mean, there are different ways of doing it. Electric bikes are a really great solution, and I think could solve some of the middle distance problems, and maybe not across the whole island. So yeah, I think there's ways to do it, and it's definitely worth trying to make them happen.
And would you like to read a bit of your book for us?
I would love to. And now I can kind of look at you. The sun is not like right in my eyes.
Okay, should I hold it for you?
Oh, that's very nice. Let me just make sure I have the right place. Yes, okay. So this is from almost the last chapter, the second to the last chapter, which is called Being a Good Ancestor, Building the Climate Cathedral. What is humanly possible? Climate change is perhaps the most enormous opportunity to test our humanity. Preventing climate breakdown is at the absolute outer limits of what we might just be capable of. It requires us to rewrite our idea of who we are, the language and concepts and traditions we use to braid our identities and culture together. It requires us to redefine and then remake what is humanly possible, what humans are capable of making possible. I am convinced that now is the most interesting time to be alive. Whether by divine plan or blind chance, it is each and every one of us alive today who happen to be the cast for a decisive moment in human history. Like all generations before us, the impacts of our decisions stretch across space and time in ways we cannot fathom. But we have an unprecedented level of power. Our decisions affect not only ourselves and our families, not only human civilization around the world, today and for millennia to come, but the very preconditions for human civilization. Whether, when, and how much rain falls, if crops ripen or wither and die. Climate stabilization is our generation's cathedral to build. Instead of bricks and mortar, our cathedral must be built from life itself, harnessing regeneration to leave a thriving, living world and a good life for ourselves and for future generations as the mark of our time on Earth. We need cathedral thinking to stop climate change. Collectively working toward a transcendent purpose we may or may not live to see accomplished, but that will outlive us all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, is there any questions from you in the audience? Yes, Thomas.
Thank you. I think we all agree that it is very important that we take positions ourselves and that there are local organizations working on this issue. But we are, I think most of us, very concerned about the lack of interest by the leading politicians in this country. We have an election next month, and what we know is that this issue is not a major one. And if there is no change now, it will continue to be a second priority in the election. So my question is, to what extent can the scientists like yourself, the researchers in this field, people who really know the facts and have studied this carefully, how could you convince the people in the government and in the parliament to take another position, a more brave position than they tend to do today? What is your possibility there?
Yeah, great question. I've asked myself this ongoing because I fully agree with you. First, I'll reply the part you mentioned about local action. That is really important. And I think I actually have the most hope for city level, or in the case of Gotland, region level, island level, climate action. There are about 24 countries in the world that have steadily declined emissions, but there are over 300 cities that have done that. So we have more than 10 times more cities, or something approximately the size population of Gotland, that are succeeding than we do countries. So I think it's possible for smaller places to move much faster. A lot of what it comes back to is, I think, trust and personal relationships, and you're closer to the decision makers, or maybe you yourself are decision makers in other capacities. So I think that is super important, and it doesn't let politicians off the hook in any means, but it is really, really important to engage and to push on your local politicians. To vote in local elections, to go to city council meetings, to speak up and write letters to the editor of the local newspaper. Those things do make a big difference. So that's some work for you to do. But what about me, my work, which is what you asked about? So I'm part of an organization called Researchers Desk. It's a group of about 80 climate researchers from around Sweden who want climate action and are trying to translate our research to climate action in Sweden. We have a report coming out in a few weeks. Well, as soon as possible, basically, by the end of August, but with the point being before the election, where we've done a survey of the political parties and analyzed their responses. And the whole point of that is to try to inform Swedish voters so that we hold politicians accountable and vote for the best climate parties. I can say from the part that's already been released here in Almedalen that the Green Party and Vänsterpartiet had the strongest climate policies from what we analyzed. But whatever party you support, it's really important that they hear from their voters that we care about climate, we want it to be at the top of the agenda, and really push for that. I was part of a debate of the climate spokespeople for the political parties called Klimatseminarium in April. And that was really depressing for me. It was super disappointing. I really felt like the politicians who were there, other than those two parties who I mentioned, who came out best in the survey and had the most ambitious plans, we're not taking it seriously enough. So I'm trying, but I'm also very open to suggestions. So let me know if you have ideas about what more scientists could do. But I guess, back to this, what you mentioned, like Cassandra feeling that I've sometimes had. I mean, I know that both from experience and from research, facts alone are not enough. I mean, people do, surveys show that citizens trust scientists and want experts to be involved in informing decision making, but we also know that politicians don't just listen to facts, and scientists alone can't do it all, but we are trying to do what we can.
Yeah, Gunilla.
I have to agree with you and disagree with you. I'm a scientist, and I was really worried when I saw what people was interested in, what the ordinary people this time for the voting. Climate came way down there. Yeah. So, and I can understand if you are a politician and you're looking what people want to happen in Sweden, and then you see that climate comes on 4th or 5th place. It was like way down there. It used to be way up there. So I think what we can do is to talk to people and tell them. And I think that it might be our responsibility as citizens to actually go out. And I think we scientists do as much as we can, and we try to, and I think people have the knowledge, but if we don't, all of us, and if we keep telling the politician that we care more about whatever, violence or whatever is now topping the list here, or money or salary, and price of gasoline is a very good one as well. Yeah, price of gasoline is like top one. It's more important than that, than climate. Then it doesn't matter. I mean, the politician, I can also say that the politicians don't do enough. We talk about that and I discuss with them. But I think that's our duty here as citizens to actually push it, because otherwise it won't happen.
Yeah.
That's definitely true. And I mean, it goes back to this idea of the circle that, the citizen role for us as individuals and as part of organizations, whether that's political parties or climate groups or local groups of any sort. I mean, it can be Lindy Hop, it can be chess, it can be farmers markets. Like, you don't have to be we're the climate group of Gotland. Whatever group you're already a part of, start bringing climate into that group and think about how that group affects climate, but also be using your voice as an organization to push politicians and decision makers, because we know that works and we know that people don't do it. I mean, the social science research on this is really clear that there are plenty of politicians actually who would be more ambitious. So it's not that the politicians need to be convinced of the need to do it. They just need to be convinced they won't lose their jobs for doing it.
Yes, my name is Gittan Freyhagen, and I started a group called Greta's Oldies 4 years ago.
First seminar held.
So I'm one. Today we are 17 groups over Sweden, and I just want to test an idea with you. I don't know if it's proper, but I'll try. And that is that Gotland is very special, and we are an island. We are very defined. Our politicians are the same as in all other parts of Sweden, but they are a little bit ahead when it comes to climate. And they've started a campaign for energy and climate that's going to work for 3 years, where they want to go out to the public and make them aware. And they started it, but I'm not at all satisfied with what they are doing. I'd say they're hardly doing anything else than advertising, so they don't reach out really. But they also done another thing, and that is that 3 months ago, I think, they decided on a plan to genomförande. Vad heter det? To carry out. And that's really interesting, because in that plan, it's only for climate, energy and climate. And in that plan, for instance, they say that 27, not 30, not 45, 27 in Gotland, they are going to have the transport emissions down by 70%. And that's very, very
That would be
much.
great.
Yes. And I hope it's not the only words. We'll see. But then, for me, we have to collaborate with the politicians. Because we have a public transport system here, but we are extremely spread out. So Gotland is the region with the most cars per person. And the region with the oldest cars per person. So we have a lot of old, bad cars for the climate. So my idea is really that we have to do something with the politicians, with our tax money, to change this. And to me that could be that we make a new system for the public transportation. So the buses keep on their schedules and all this, but around the buses we make a system with small cars, electric cars perhaps, and they will cost the same as a trip with the bus. And if they are like a taxi, you call them and they are in your distance for walking, then within 20 minutes, for instance, then I think we can drop our cars. At least our second car in the family. But that's good enough, I think. But are we going to go down 70% till 27? Then we have to do things. Is it realistic? Is it worth fighting for, this idea? What is your feeling?
Well, first, thank you for starting Gratis Gamlingar. I have seen them all over Sweden, and I know that you're making a big difference. So it's very cool to be here with the founder and to know that you're still working really hard. I agree. I think it is really productive to, work with politicians and also hold politicians accountable. So there's maybe there's different roles there. Like media, for example, needs to really hold politicians accountable. But I think it's really worth collaborating, like you say. And to me, that sounds like a great idea. So the study that I mentioned that we just published about the 12 ways to reduce cars in cities, an open question was, how effective is car sharing? One study, for example, found it could replace around 12 private cars with one shared car. So the key question for emissions is, how much do you drive, the kilometers driven? Because more than 90, almost 95% of emissions from cars comes from driving them. For most things, it's like, I write a newsletter called We Can Fix It. And a few months ago, the topic was the one time that buying new is better for climate, and that is to get an electric car, to replace a fossil car with an electric car. Because the embodied emissions of the thing are usually quite important. So like for clothing, the best thing is wear it as long as you possibly can. But for a car, because more than 90% of the emissions comes from using it, because a car is a machine for burning fossil fuels, it's better to replace it as soon as possible. So that said, the most sustainable thing is to reduce the amount of car use as much as possible. Just substituting electric vehicles for fossil cars is not going to be enough for Sweden to meet its climate goals. And as you know, Sweden will not meet its climate law unless we actually make this reducing 70% by 2030 is the interim goal, and we're not on track to do that. So we have to reduce car use and the kilometers driven. So I think whatever you can do to do that is a really big step forward. And to me, your idea sounds like a good one.
Thank you.
So keep going. Genomföra your idea.
Hey, I'm Salka, and thank you. It's nice to listen. I was wondering if maybe it's not your speciality, but I was curious about farming. So you said that, like, for example, reducing meat consumption to, I don't remember what you said now, 200 hamburgers a month or something. But like, I previously had the idea that, like, okay, when I do eat red meat, I'm going to buy ecological meat. But then recently, I've had discussions with friends that actually ecological farming consumes more water and land and resources. And so there's this ethical question around, okay, the care of the animal, but then also for the land and for your body. So I feel like, I don't know, I was just curious if you have some more knowledge there to share, or how to, because in one way, buying ecological meat is sort of more focused on the animal, I assume, but then also not using toxins or pesticides and stuff like that contaminate the earth. That was one question. And then I was also just curious about because I've been working with an artist who always traveled by train, so I travel a lot of train, but then I actually traveling to Gotland and taking this big boat rather than flying 40 minutes. Like, is it actually will the flying always be more fossil fuel heavy than taking a boat or a lorry shipped to the States, for example, or cargo ship?
Yeah. Okay. I'm really glad you asked about agriculture, because that didn't come up, and it's also essential. I mean, I focus on fossil fuels because about 75% of our climate pollution comes from burning fossil fuels. But that remaining 25% comes from agriculture, from using land and from deforestation, which is mostly for agriculture. And the biggest part of the biggest driver of climate pollution and deforestation from agriculture is animal agriculture. So I have a colleague who says, if you're concerned about deforestation in the Amazon to plant soy, the best thing you can do is eat more soy, because that soy is actually going to feed cows, and that's a very inefficient process. So basically, eating lower on the food chain and eating plants rather than feeding plants that people could eat to animals and then eating those is always going to save a huge amount of emissions, water, as well. So, I mean, that is, from a climate perspective, that's by far the most important, is to reduce meat consumption. There's Elin Rus, who's at SLU, has a plan for Swedish and actually for Nordic agriculture called Livestock from Leftovers that I really like. So she's developed that in collaboration with farmers and NGOs. The basic idea is that it's silly for people to eat animals. It's silly for animals to eat food that people could eat. So people should eat food. Animals should eat things that people cannot eat. And that might be grazing on grass. That might be eating food waste that, peels and scrap and things that people can't consume, but that animals can. And that is a way to make farming a lot more circular and regenerative by keeping all those pieces in the system, basically, and integrating animals in agriculture on farms. So from the bottom line, it's most important to reduce your meat consumption, and once you've done that, you can worry about organic or not, if you're thinking from a climate perspective, because organic doesn't make a big difference from a climate perspective. It does in other ways. But I think, if people ate a healthy and sustainable diet that had the meat that I mentioned, 2 burgers a month, a couple of servings per week of fish and chicken and eggs, then we have enough resources to do organic agriculture as well. So that's kind of what we need to do. And then the question, I haven't run the calculations. I don't know the exact answer for Gotland. I think it's tough to get here in a climate-friendly way, because I saw the big fossil sign on the boat that I took yesterday, which of LNG, liquefied natural gas. That's a fossil fuel. The magazine on the boat was very careful to right away mention that they have plans to become climate neutral and they want to switch away from fossil fuels and have electrify. And that all sounds great, but they need to do that. I guess the main point is there is basically no way to make flying climate friendly. Because of physics. You cannot, it just takes a huge amount of energy to lift stuff up in the air and fly it around. But you can actually, it's technically possible to make shipping climate friendly. So I think in general, it's better to kind of push on that side and support that industry if you have to make the choice, which you do in Gotland. best of all would be to sail, and my husband and I have a goal to sail across the Atlantic, which means we need to learn how to sail. But we're planning to buy a sailboat together with some friends next summer and get going on that. So, I mean, that would be ideal, but more difficult maybe. But maybe that's part of the transport of like, or maybe, you know, Gotland talking about tourism, attracting more sailing tourism and having people, you know, partnering with sailing clubs in Sweden to send people here, for example.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. Gunilla.
Now I have to disagree again. I know that KTH actually they say that short flights per person in the flight is less dangerous for the climate compared to ferries, because the ferries still are worse. And the problem with the ferry is also that there are other things that they pollute with in their gases. So, and then okay, you can say the ferry has to go anyway because we need the food and thing. But if you look at per person and for the koldioxid, then short flights is better than the ferry, right? It's not true.
Yes,
So for Gotland, you shouldn't be that worried about taking these short flights because you never go that high up. They also become much better of using, instead of having a lot of power, they go up and then they go down directly. So they are at least the big companies. I don't think Ryanair is one of those, but the big one is actually trying. So it's the long one is the bad one when you have to go up further up in the
I mean, flying in general per hour causes a lot of climate pollution. I think in Sweden it's 93% of our flying emissions come from flying outside of Sweden. So, and those are the flights that people are the most resistant to giving up. So we really haven't done what we need to yet in terms of, I mean, there is a flight tax in Sweden, but it was not very differentiated between short and long flights. And, you know, it's a huge difference in how much climate pollution there is. So it's the long haul flights, the longer that you fly, that has the biggest emissions. And, you know, I talked to fly, for example, from Ireland to New York and back is 1.6 tons, and a sustainable budget that for each person is around 2.1 tons. So, you know, it's almost 80% of your whole carbon budget for the year to take that one round trip flight. You haven't eaten anything, you haven't gone anywhere else, you haven't heated or lit your home. So it is a really big source of emissions.
No, I agree with you on that one, and I think the other thing that the ferry, for instance, to Gotland, if it like just go a little bit slower, it will save a lot of it. But just going 15 minutes or half an hour for some people is really, really bad. And I think these are things that we could think of. I remember when I was a kid, you slept over on the boat and you woke up in the morning, and that was not a problem. And now 15 minutes is a problem. And something has changed.
I think, and you also mentioned that in the book, that one thing we really have to reconsider is time in our new life, new world, changed world, is that we have to have more time for travel, for moving, and that's a fact. I think you can't really go around that. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I wish I had written down what you said to the kids today, because they're so good. Like, yes, this is it. I mean, you basically said if you're going fast, far, and heavy is bad for climate. It's like, yeah, there you go. You got it.
Yeah.
So, I guess people are running off to other things. Any more questions?
I could go on forever, but I think you want to read the book and then you will have more questions. But then you have this wonderful monthly newsletter from Kimberly that you can start getting. So that's it.
Yeah. I just wanted to say we are not so many here, but I'm very pleased to see some of our politicians are here.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
the media is here. So I really hope that this has, that we, with this discussion, have given you some new ideas. So thank you.
make sure they get the book and read the checklist at the end.
Yes. There is, if you have short of time, you even have a short checklist at the end. You can start with that. And, wonderful. I had this dream and it went true. Thank you, Nana.